Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Glave, and I'm very happy to be here today at Brooklyn College with Larry Chang, founder of the Gay Freedom Movement, also known as GFM in Jamaica, in the late 1970s. And I'm going to be asking Larry some questions today. We're going to be talking about your history, Larry, and this formidable achievement that you did with the Jamaican gay movement as you began it. And I was curious, just to start off with a question. You've heard this before, right? That many people, often outside of the region, Caribbean, have said that Jamaica is, quote, the most homophobic place on earth, right, unquote. And what do you think, like, how would you respond to that comment, knowing with your very broad and precise background as an activist in Jamaica?
Well, first of all, I'm not qualified to compare it to anywhere else, since I don't really know about anywhere else. Certainly, I have found it to be homophobic, and other people have too. Whether it's the most homophobic, how do you measure,
Exactly.
that? It's almost meaningless, to say that. But having said that, it definitely is homophobic, which is, why I am actually even in the United States, because I had to, leave my own country of birth and, seek asylum here in the U.S. So, that alone speaks, volumes.
Well, indeed now, can you please, this is very interesting, can you talk about some of the dynamics that led you to think about forming the GFM in Jamaica in 1978, no? It was, right? We're sitting here today, June 21st, 2011. So much history has passed, much of which you helped to bring about, right, since that time. So what was it that inspired you to come at that point to form an organization like the GFM?
Well, it wasn't accidental, if I may say it so. It was not unconscious, but it was certainly not part of a plan, but was something that was in the cards. First of all, I went to school in the United States. I attended college in Oakland, California, which is right next door to Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, which was the fountainhead of progressive thought and radicalism in the 1970s. So obviously, being in that kind of environment and having been influenced by radical thought, it's not surprising that when I graduated and went back to Jamaica, that I should take back some of that, radical activism with me. I had also made a contract with myself, in going back to Jamaica, that I was going to go back on my own terms. I was going to live with as much integrity as I could. I was not going to live a double life. I was not going to be duplicitous, and all of that good stuff. And so, in my own mind, it was just a matter of time before I knew I would buck up against, the prevailing societal attitudes. And I knew that if I was going to be true to my own contract with myself, that I was going to have to take a principled stand.
Yes, right, exactly, which you did, as we've seen, right, which we'll talk about some more in a few minutes through the publications that GFM did, which you edited and so on. I was going to ask you also now, in hearing what you've just said, if you can share with us some of the, if you will, the positive experiences, memories, etc., that you had. For example, unexpected acceptance in unexpected quarters or parties and community moments, things like that.
I'm glad you asked that question, because I don't very often get the opportunity to, to recall some of those favorable and pleasant moments. And I can start very simply, and again, I base everything off of my own experience, because that's all I know. It wasn't very long after I returned to Jamaica and started living in Kingston that...
and that was when, I'm sorry?
This was in, let me see, I went back in 1973, I believe. I'm not very good with dates. So around 1973, I was in Kingston, and I started to meet one gay person after another, and each one led to another, and you know, and so the network grew. But what I was very pleasantly surprised at was that there actually was a network, a very vibrant and extensive network of gay people, as we call them then, and not LGBT.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, there was quite an extensive network of gay people in Jamaica, both in Kingston and in rural areas. And there was a whole slew of establishments, you know, bars and clubs, and, you know, it was a highly developed social milieu. And so I was really happy to discover this and, you know, try to absorb and to be absorbed into it as much as I could. Yeah. So for me, that was the greatest and the pleasantest surprise, because before then, you know, I always had this, and I think many people would have shared this same kind of impression, that, you know, it's the metropolitan countries and cities in particular that invented gay life. But, you know, I'm here to say, you know, that's not so, because, you know, it existed in all kinds of different forms, you know, right throughout Jamaica.
Right, and you grew up in the country,
I
right?
did.
In Brownstown. Right, and so did you see, were there encounters in a context of gayness in Brownstown in your experience?
Not directly, but I did meet people from Brownstown subsequently who told me about the history of gay life in Brownstown when I was a child, you know, so, you know, that really blew my mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because, yes, we don't always know that it's going on, but it's there, no?
I mean, when I was growing up in Brownstown, you know, of course, I didn't know what the word gay was even, so, but I knew I was different, and I thought that I was the only person in the entire universe that was like this. Only to discover later on that, you know, there was a subculture in Brownstown at the time, and this is during the 1950s and the 1960s when I grew up. You know, and it was totally unknown to me at the time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you're saying that I find really, really fascinating here, right, is that you're talking about the 50s and the 60s. So
yes.
Before independence, in the colonial era,
That's
through
right.
independence, then, right, and going on.
Yeah.
Would you tell the story, please, about the Spanish court kind of lecture demonstration that you did? With,
Okay, you're jumping ahead.
No, yes, I'm jumping ahead to, this was what, 1979, 80?
Yes, it was about 79, I guess, yeah.
And just tell us what a Spanish court is and what happened there.
Okay, Spanish Court was a popular mini shopping plaza at the time, and
in Kingston,
in
right?
Kingston, yeah, in New Kingston, more specifically, and there was a restaurant there that had an outdoor seating area. I even forget what the name of the restaurant is now. Anyway, and upstairs the restaurant was a very popular nightclub called Epiphany. I'm not even sure if it's still there. But anyway, so we were, a bunch of us, all guys, went to have, oh, this restaurant stayed open late. So we went there after some party or something to have something to eat. And we were all there having a good time, and some people started to leave the club upstairs, and on the way down and past us, obviously perceived something that alerted them to the fact that, well, here was a bunch of gay guys, and so they made an alarm. Normally, in circumstances such as that, the people who are so scrutinized would usually deny any kind of you know, different orientation or anything. But in this case, we stood our ground and said, well, yes, we are gay, and so what, you know. And just adopting that psychological position was revolutionary, because this is probably the first time that anybody in public ever adopted that political stance. Yeah.
And this year would have been.
This was about 1979. Yeah. And very soon it developed into an intellectual exchange, and I use that very decidedly because they were open, they were receptive, they were listening, they were curious, and they plied us with questions, and sensible questions, as to, well, what you guys do, and then why are you doing this, and all kinds of very basic questions. But the fact that they were open, made it a meaningful exchange. The other thing that I found very significant was that they were mostly couples, and what would happen is that the guys would take home their dates and they would come back to participate.
The men came back without the
men
women.
came back without the women to participate in the discussion. Now there were about 5 or 6 of us, I can't really remember. And this being a restaurant, each one of us kind of had a different group gravitate. It was like a workshop, really. And so we each had our own table with our own group around us. Just being who we were, and answering questions as candidly and as honestly as we could. And I think what happened then was that, first of all, we displayed such public courage, and I think that the audience, because that's what they were an audience, couldn't help but be, won over, bowled over, I mean, we joked about it afterwards, we described them as all being in their serried ranks, sitting like the disciples at the foot of Jesus, listening. But it really did have that sense of, the Sermon on the Mount, of revelation, of, a breakthrough. And because of that, all of us who participated in that experience, we were high for days after that, just knowing that, we had maintained our integrity and just, said who we were and stuck with it. And just that was, by itself, was so empowering. Yeah.
Yes, and that had happened right in Kingston.
And that happened right in the heart of Kingston.
Right, with all the reputation for violence and everything, and yet.
Okay, so this brings up a very interesting question that I'm often asked. People say, well, how did you guys do all of that so early, back in the day, what about the violence and the this and the that, which you referred to? And, my response is that in those days, there were gentler times.
In Jamaica.
In Jamaica, where you could sit down at an outdoor restaurant and have such a conversation. I don't think you could do that today. So, in other words, what I think I'm seeing is that positions and attitudes have hardened. Whereas before, I think there was a certain level of unsophistication and naivete that allowed for that kind of exchange to happen. Now, everybody has the internet, and they have cable, and so they know what's going on, and so therefore, everything is on the table, and so that by itself, I think, has led to these kinds of hardened positions.
I wonder, do you think that part of the acceptance at that time and the curiosity with that group had to do with the fact that you were a pretty diverse group of people? I mean, you were Chinese Jamaican, there were brown and black Jamaicans in that group, true? So that maybe just seeing such a different group of people, diversity that is, right? They could not say, oh, they're all one type, or these are Jamaicans.
I think that's a valid observation, but I don't think that that observation would have come until much later. The primary observation, I think, at that point would have been, oh my God, this man admits that he is a Batman. Just that alone would be, the biggest hurdle.
Right. And we're talking about Jamaica at the time when JVC, there was only one channel on television. Right, it came on at 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I think there was that children's program, I remember that.
I need black and white.
And black and white, exactly. And it ended at 11:30 at night or something. So there was no cable.
Yeah, with the national anthem.
Exactly. No kind of, and many Jamaican commercials and things, but not much, not too much from other countries. So it was very much more limited than it is
Yeah,
now.
this was the days before the explosion in electronic media.
Exactly, exactly. But it seems to me like I'm hearing you say that that was a strategy that you employed, right? To actually be very direct and very upfront to show how much you all accepted yourselves and that you would take a strong stand. And can you talk some more about some of the strategies that you employed as an activist in GFM and also when you helped to found JFlag, what 20 years later, eh? What do you think of some of the strategies and maybe the differences between them over time?
Well, the primary strategy was and always has been for JFM developing self-awareness, consciousness raising, because I felt that until we were secure in who we were as individuals, then we wouldn't be able to accomplish anything else until we got that basic inner work done. And so that was the foundation of all of the rest of the programs that we did.
And you went about that work by, for example, you did so much. I mean,
well, first of all, we started a library. It was actually my own library, which I then turned into, the GFM library. I donated all my books to this library.
And where was that library?
It was in my house, yeah.
Right, in Kingston.
In Kingston, yeah. So, well, my house was like a community center because obviously we didn't have any kind of other facilities. So,
where were you living at the time?
I was living at Gallery Way, which is right in New Kingston as well. And I do have to say that, I'm a person of privilege in the Jamaican context, in the sense that I was middle class, I owned my own house, I had a car and a job, I was basically self-employed. So I did not have the same kinds of limitations that, a gay working Jamaican would have had in terms of being afraid to come out, because they may lose their job, get thrown out of their home, whatever, So, and this is true both of me and of Brian Williamson, who came along later, in that we were from the middle class and we did have a certain amount of privilege that afforded us this kind of opportunity to do what we did. And so, I say that to say that it's not easy to look at the Jamaican situation and say, well, why doesn't somebody else come out? Why doesn't JFlag have a public face? And that's the answer. Unless you are independently, not necessarily wealthy, but you can stand on your own 2 feet. You don't have to answer to anybody, job-wise or in terms of where you live. It is extremely difficult because you will get thrown out of your house or apartment. Yeah, you will have mobs coming to beat down your door. You will get fired from your job. We have to face, those facts, yeah.
In speaking about this, right, these strategies as well that you've been talking about, as well as the realities, you talked about people being self-empowered and coming to consciousness. Mm-hmm. So GFM, as you know, did so much work in the Jamaican countryside as well. There were people who wrote, right, mm-hmm. to the organization. So how did that kind of Central Jamaica and Western Jamaica and Eastern Jamaica population get to know about GFM?
Very simple mechanism. You have to remember again, this is the days before electronic media. We did not have the internet. Facebook did not exist. It would be so much easier today if we were doing it all over again. Yeah. So we had the old snail mail, the Jamaican Postal Service. Yeah. So we had a letter writing campaign to the Daily Gleaner, which was I think only one of 2 newspapers at the time. And so we had letters regularly in the paper, and at the end of the letter would be our name, Gay Freedom Movement, and our post office box address. And so this was published. This was the only publicity basically that we had, because we even tried to run ads in the newspaper and they refused to accept them.
In the Gleaner?
In the Gleaner, yeah. In fact, I believe in the archives that we're going to see later, there is a reproduction of one of the ads that we tried to run. Yeah. Anyway, so our address at the end of our letters in the daily newspaper was the only means we had. But then, of course, the Gleaner had an extremely wide coverage of Jamaica. You know, it saturated Jamaica basically, and got into every nook and cranny. And so anybody with any eyes would have seen it, and they would then have written to us. And that's how, you know, we were able to establish, you know, this network of correspondence right throughout the length and breadth of Jamaica. The one address that stands out in my mind, you know, what is this, 20, 30 years later, is somebody writing from Hayes, Cornpiece District, Clarendon. I remember that address to this day.
Right,
Yes.
Clarendon. Yes, central Jamaica.
I mean, I was so touched by that, to know that our communications were reaching somebody in Cornpiece District.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In 1979, or whatever the year was. Yeah. And that it was bringing some kind of hope, some kind of positive whatever, to counteract all of the years, indeed centuries, of negative conditioning and, you know, things that people have been subjected to. Yeah?
Yes, exactly. Now you're talking about this letter writing campaign. Now,
Yeah.
how many people in GFM? The working body was roughly how many people?
I would say, okay, well, let me backtrack a bit. One of the major GFM had was our newsletter, which was called Jamaica Daily News, which was a takeoff of the name of the other newspaper, the Jamaica Daily News. So anyway, we just changed the D to a G, using their same font and design as our masthead, but just changing the letter. So
That was
that
a
was
conservative paper too. The Daily News was a bit conservative, more conservative than the Gleaner.
no, it was a little bit less, because you have to remember that the Daily News was in competition with the Gleaner, which was the status quo, and therefore they had to try harder, you know, like Avis.
Yeah, right.
So they, you know, were a little bit, maybe more receptive. Anyway, so our newsletter was the main program that we had, and we had maybe about 4 or 5 regular contributors to the paper. Of course, we all wrote under pseudonyms, so because in those days nobody came out. Yeah, so I mean, I know who all the pseudonyms are, I think. But anyway, yeah, and so it's this core group of writers who would, you know, answer letters that came up in the paper, or field, you know, different stories and things.
Yes, because one of the things that you see in the archives, the GFM archives, right, is all these letters coming from country and different parts, right, parishes, and then GFM people responding to,
Right.
right. So you achieve so much with such a small body of people, right?
Yeah.
5 people.
One of the programs that emerged out of those letters too was we were receiving a lot of letters from inmates. Yeah, St. Catherine District Prison, as well as the Tower Street Correctional Center. Those were the 2 main ones. We would get letters from inmates who, you know, self-identified as being gay, and of course they were in even more isolation, being, you know, incarcerated and, you know, having to put up with, you know, prison conditions and so on. And so we started to visit these guys in prison and, you know, take them stuff like towels and toilet paper and soap and so on. And out of that grew our POP, Prison Outreach Program, POP. Yeah, so that program grew out of those letters.
Amazing the work that you could, I mean, achieve with, again, this small group of people, but the dedication, and then the bravery of these prisoners to write to you, and you see what an effect you had, in effect, by reaching this very vast and diverse population. What about youth? Wasn't the GFM doing a youth program of some kind?
Yes, because we very early on recognized that a lot of our activities centered around bars and clubs and parties, because, you know, that was the subculture that existed then. And we recognized that there were a lot of young gay people growing up, you know, who couldn't go to bars and clubs and so on. And so we said, well, you know, we have to do something to reach out to them and to include them. And so we started a series of film shows. You know, we would, you know, get some film and show it in one of the bars and clubs during off hours or at somebody's house. We planned beach parties, beach outings, volleyball matches, you know, things like that that they could participate in a safe environment and in an affirmative environment, which, you know, before that was just not available to them.
Right, exactly.
And so that became part of GYM, G-Y-M, Gay Youth Movement.
Right, exactly.
So that program grew out of that. Yeah.
And through all this, what was the proportion of women to men in both in the organizing itself, in the organizing of the organization, but also in the activities and some of the responses that you got and so on?
Women were always a minority for many reasons. First of all, I don't know that women felt as marginalized as gay men, because women had an easier time of it because two women could live together in those days without anybody, you know, thinking anything. Today, if two women live together, then people would begin to, you know, think things.
Unless they were two old women, maybe.
Right. Yeah, but in those days, two women could live together and nobody would think anything. Two women could walk hand in hand, arm in arm, and nobody would think anything. I don't think they can do that today. Yeah, so I don't think that women felt as threatened, you know, as gay men, and so probably didn't think that, you know, this really had much to offer them. So that's my own explanation of why we didn't have as many women. But we did have women at the organizational level, and, you know, who also participated. One of our stalwarts on the Gaily News team was female, Donna Smith. So,
Oh yes, who later on went to
yeah.
be a founding member of J-Flag and is
Yes,
now in
and
South Africa.
founding member and first co-chair.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, you know, that whole thing of having co-chairs for J-Flag grew out of that conscious effort to establish gender parity and to include women, you know, at every level. And so J-Flag was structured to have a male co-chair and a female co-chair.
Right, early on.
Yeah, from the
Yes,
get-go.
exactly. We'll talk about J-Flag in a second. It was, as of course we know, J-Flag was able to do a lot of work, a lot of its work, built upon the GFM Foundation, including the post office box, right, which you handed over to us, right, so that the post office box 1152 is part of our history.
Right.
Because that is...
In Stony Hill.
And yes, near Waterworks. And someone even said, I think recently, oh, it's so far to go to Waterworks and Stony Hill and everything. I said, no, man, it's part of a history, so you have to keep it because, you know. But yes, just the thing about women that I was also interested in is that we've said before that many of the issues that faced women as well, be they domestic violence or issues of safety in other contexts, or like rape and sexual assault, poverty, etc., were long-standing issues, right, alongside homophobia, but many of those issues were immediately pressing because many women were living with all kinds, especially poorer women, but women of all classes were dealing with all kinds of oppressions in that regard, right? So they were, the kind of, the balance was somewhat different in some ways, and men were targeted in very different ways, right, which we saw. Now, I'm curious about the Jamaica Gaily News, because it was a mimeographed publication,
yeah.
Right? So you did this mimeographed publication. It was, how frequently was it published, and where did you do this mimeographing, and how did you distribute it?
All interesting questions. I wish I had the answers, but you know, my memory isn't that good. Anyway, It started out as a monthly. Some months we did 2 issues, and some months we did 3 issues. I mean, it just depended on who was available to do what, when, and what resources were available. And also what issues were burning. I mean, we may not have had an issue that was due, but, some event or other would have occurred, and we decided, well, no, we have to put an issue up because...
By event, what do you mean by event?
Somebody could have been stabbed, let's say, or, a new club could have opened, or, something would have happened which would then prompt us to, go into publication.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was also in the time when it was not so easy to get photocopying machines.
Well, no,
in Jamaica.
If I'm not mistaken, very few places had photocopy machines. This is why it was mimeographed. And it started out being mimeographed, I believe, at the JIS, Jamaica Information Services, because we had members who worked with the JIS, and so we were able to use government paper and government services and government equipment to produce this. So you have to remember that we were an underground organization. So a lot of things we had to do surreptitiously, and
Right, but then with the distribution, right?
With the distribution, it was sent by mail to subscribers, and it was also distributed through all of the gay bars and clubs. Yeah.
And you said all of the gay bars.
Because there were, sometimes there were as many as 3 or 4 or 5, but they opened and they closed. So
where mostly were
most of them were in Kingston, but on occasion there have been some in Montego Bay and Spanish Town. Yeah.
Right. This is throughout the 70s and into
Yes.
the 80s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you would go to these bars and to the parties that were held.
Well, if I didn't go personally,
Or
then
else.
somebody else would be going, and then they would take a bunch of Gaelic news with them, and it would be distributed that way. But the other thing too is that we also very early on were very cognizant of the archival value of Gaelic news, and so we sent it to the West Indies Record Library, which is the Jamaican Archives. We sent copies to the Prime Minister's office, as well as to the Governor General and to the Library of the University of the West Indies. Whether or not these were ever kept, I have no idea. We suspect that they were immediately tossed as they were received, but who knows?
Did you ever receive a response from the Prime Minister's office?
Of course not.
No, right? But these days, who knows, right? But,
Yeah.
no, but then I was just going to ask you that. Like, did you have a sense of the historical importance?
But of course, because I mean, this is the first time this is being attempted, in Jamaica, and probably even in the Caribbean.
In the Caribbean.
That I'm not sure of.
In the
Yeah.
Caribbean. Because you did very meticulously, right, document all of these issues, the actual numbers of the GFM, and
Well, the issues, we archived the issues diligently. There were 2 complete sets of Jamaica Gaelic News. One which I regarded as my personal set, and the other set, I put aside for posterity. When I left Jamaica, I foolishly handed over both sets to J-Flag, for their safekeeping. And of course, now they cannot be found. So, that is the one thing that I regret.
both sets are missing, or just
Both
one set?
sets are missing,
Oh, yes,
because I gave both of them
yeah,
to J-Flag.
Right.
I'm happy though to say that complete sets are available in Toronto, in the archives of the Body Politic, which was then the leading gay paper in Canada, because we had exchange arrangements with them. And another complete set is in Amsterdam at COK.
Right. COK stands for...
I don't know. I don't speak Dutch.
That's a Dutch acronym.
Yeah, it's a
But
Dutch acronym.
Isn't there are also some GFMs in the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, not true?
That would be the Body Politic set.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
because they would have, the body politic has closed. So the Canadian Gay and Lesbian Archives would probably have gotten hold of those archives.
So can you speak a little, please, about what some of the differences were that you noticed in general in organizing and activism when you helped to found JFlag versus the context in which you were operating with GFM so many decades 2 decades later, right?
Yeah, because there was a marked difference. Okay, let me say very positively that I was so impressed. Well, first of all, let me go back a bit in the sense that I very early on, this is under the GFM banner now, recognized that it was strategically wise to have somebody else be the public face of GFM that looked like the majority of Jamaicans.
I know you've said this before, and I've always disagreed with you, but go ahead, please, talk about that.
Well,
what do you... No, talk about that, please.
You know, well, I'm just saying it because that's what I thought. I thought that the public face of GFM needed to be a black face in order for GFM to have any kind of traction or credibility. Yeah? And so because of that, we had a very black person who then took over the leadership of GFM, and I stepped back. And in any case, I was suffering from burnout because, you know, I had been doing this now for so many years and it felt like I had the whole world on my shoulders and blah, 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 blah. So anyway, I was, you know, grateful, relieved, overjoyed, you know, to have St. Hope Thomas, you know, come to the fore to lead GFM. Unfortunately, he died, you know, like within 2 years. And so with his death, that's when GFM kind of fizzled because I certainly couldn't go back and pick it up again. It just, you know, I just couldn't do it. It just was behind me. So years later, how many years later, I don't know. Again, I was really relieved when, without my prompting, you know, there was this groundswell of interest and initiative in trying to, you know, reorganize, you know, some kind of, you know, answer to our social predicament. So, and I was very impressed with the caliber of people that were involved in the beginning, who were all young, bright, educated, and intelligent Jamaicans. Yeah, and so I was happy to lend my support and to be involved and everything, but you know, they took the ball and they ran with it. You know, and it was just so gratifying to see that because you know, well, for me, it showed me that, well, okay, you know, the work that we had done so many years earlier, you know, had borne some kind of fruit because, you know, this was, you know, one of the results. Yeah, so, you know, I was just very proud of it.
As I remember, you also were like a child in a candy store with the technology, because you said, there's all this technology now that can be used that...
Well,
right?
well, this is it, because when in GFM days, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have computers, we didn't have all of that stuff. We didn't have fax machines, right, for God's sake.
Exactly, exactly.
Whereas now, these years later, I'm not sure, yeah, I think computers were just coming in. I don't remember, I get all my things mixed up. But anyway, yes, so a lot more technology was available.
Yes. And the globalization.
Right. And we also had people who were professionals, yeah. We had lawyers and organizers and...
people in the ministry of health. And
I mean, we had some professionals early on too, but they were a lot more cagey and you know, circumspect back then, as everything was. But this younger generation had a lot of commitment and dynamism, and they also had language. Yes, they could articulate things. Whereas back in GFM days, it was maybe only 2 or 3 of us that could really, you know, articulate anything.
Right.
And so, you know, it really took gay activism in Jamaica to another level. And their agenda was also different from GFM's, whereas GFM's was foundational, it was basic, it was consciousness raising, it was all of that. I think that J-Flag took on a more constitutional approach in terms of trying to address legislation and addressing things from a human rights perspective and so on and so forth.
Parliament.
Right, which to me is an evolution, of the struggle.
Yeah, so I'm building on what GFM
Yes,
had accomplished,
yes.
right? And then going on to challenge the buggery
Right.
law and
This is not to say that a lot of the social programs that we did were not necessary, and they still are. And in fact, I have heard that this is one of the major criticisms of JFLAG today, is that they're not addressing a lot of the social needs. People who are kicked out of homes, people who are homeless, unemployed, all the rest of it.
as they try, but there's such a shortfall.
There has always been a lack of resources, but hey, we did all we did without any resources.
No resources, yeah.
So
one of the things that we were struck by in JFLAG was, and we talked about this, right, is the ways in which the headlines in the 1970s and the 1980s that were defaming headlines and so on, or just sarcastic or silly, were the same sorts of things that we began to see in the 1990s. And you had that particular historical perspective to be able to make the direct correlation, both in terms of your generational advancement, right, having been someone earlier, and your experience on the ground, right? So you actually saw both of, and you remarked on it on several occasions, that haven't we evolved past some of the silliness, and the prurience, and yet, what was interesting is that I think about how the Gleaner did indeed publish GFM's letters, right? As challenging as they might have been to the status quo. And then some of the things that JFLAG, when we began to get different people to write in and so on, they did actually address the discourse, I think, that GFM made possible, right? That actually people were able to open their eyes and ears, really benefited JFLAG in the 1990s and into the 21st century, right, because of that history. Can you let's talk a little bit now? You've done so much in Jamaica. What about the sort of the decision, your experience as someone who has received political asylum? Is that people did say, for example, about you, as you know, Larry Chang would be the last person we would ever think of who would leave Jamaica, right? And yet you made a decision that really shocked many people, myself included. You can just talk about your experience with political asylum?
Well, okay, let me go back a bit and say why I even got to the point where I felt that I had to, flee to protect my life, was because, I actually was threatened a number of times. My house was stoned continuously.
In Kingston?
In Kingston, my house in Kingston was stoned. My car was vandalized. And of course I was taunted and called names and things, but I mean, that's not that important. But I was also threatened with a machete, right in my face. Things like, of course I would get threatening phone calls. So then I took the decision that, okay, I'm going to go out to the country and lay low. So I took this job in Martha Brae Trelawney, went there. And even there, now I got wind that, people were going to come and get me and, all the rest of it. So that was what, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, because I said, look, there is nowhere in Jamaica then that I can go that I'm going to be safe. So that was when I made the decision that, I had to leave the country. And so that's what prompted me to do it. So then I got to the US on my regular visitor's visa, and then once I got here, I filed for asylum and submitted all my documentation and received it, a year or two later, I can't remember. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say that just speaking from my own part and other people's part too, right, that Jamaica seemed a little lonelier after you left. I mean, you were really missed. And I think that there's still that spirit of a pioneer, like when a pioneer leaves and you feel like that backbone.
I have to say I was touched because straight people that I know would come to me and, they would say, I can't believe that you are leaving, So I know that it impacted a lot of people, far beyond the gay community. Because I was involved in so many things, in Jamaican life. The arts, culture, industry, commerce, all kinds of things, which I was a central part of. And so, just one person withdrawing, affected so many different fields. So I guess that's why it was so widely felt.
Yes, but the spirit of what you did and that presence lives on, and just really and truly. And I want to thank you for that. And just in closing, just ask you, on June 21st, 2011, what words of advice, encouragement, insight would you offer to people in Jamaica, for example, and maybe the broader Caribbean, if you like, organizing now, in this particular moment?
I hesitate to give any kind of word of advice because already, I've been slapped.
Oh.
Yeah, by people in Jamaica who say that you have left and therefore you don't have any right to tell us anymore what to do. So, on that note.
Well, let's say just insights or or just words of parting.
Okay, the only thing I can say is an observation. I think that the gay community in Jamaica has evolved tremendously, that there are now factions in Jamaica. Yeah, one faction of which is pro-gay flag, and the other faction which is anti-gay flag, which I'm,
the blogging people.
In the blogosphere at least.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the fact that we can arrive at a point where we can be critical of our own institutions, I think that's an evolution, yeah? And that can only be healthy because that will encourage more discourse, more exchange, more conversation. And, my only point though is that rather than criticizing J-Flag for what it's doing or not doing, start another organization. There doesn't have to be just one. Start another organization that will do what you think needs to be done that J-Flag is not doing.
Yes, and then look at that richness,
exactly.
Right? That's coming out of the GFM family tree.
There you go.
Into all the branches.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. It comes back to this binary thinking that it has to be this or that. It doesn't have to be this or that. It can be this and that, exactly. And something else again. Yeah?
Exactly. Larry, thank you so much for everything that you've done, but also for talking and sharing these wonderful reminiscences and just giving us